Well, hello again. We got one more topic to discuss before the second exam, and so that's what we're going to do today and talk about a little bit about vitamins and minerals. And as you're probably aware, there's many different types of minerals available or vitamins available for consumption, but that's really not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk more about what these molecules actually do. And it's very difficult to come up with a good definition of what a vitamin is, but basically it's an essential nutrient, meaning that it's something that we absolutely have to survive, but we can't make it ourselves, so we have to ingest it. And we divide all these vitamins into two groups, the fat-soluble vitamins and the water-soluble vitamins, and they have quite different modes of action, as we'll see. There's a couple of things about vitamins in general, and that is there are a number of deficiencies in vitamins that cause symptoms, and more often than not, it's due to more the deficiency in more than one vitamin rather than in a single vitamin, and that's because, as you imagine, if somebody has a poor diet, uh, either by choice or because that's all they can find, usually if they're lacking in one vitamin, they're likely to be lacking in others as well. The other thing is when you try to measure vitamin levels, if you measure blood levels, it's more indicative of how much of the vitamin you've recently taken up rather than your overall body status. So it's very difficult to measure uh, how much, or the vitamin levels in a person. Really much easier just to give them some extra vitamins. Okay, I want to talk about the water soluble or B vitamins first. And these all basically act as coenzymes in metabolic pathways. So I'm sure you've visited some of these already, particularly when Dr. Bartling was lecturing. Um, the thing about the B vitamins is there's really no storage capacity for them, with the exception of vitamin B12, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So excess of B vitamins are generally excreted in the urine. Um, if you've ever taken supplements with vitamins in it, then you know that if you have an excess of folic acid, it will turn the urine very yellow. Or if you have an excess of B1 or thiamine, you get that unique smell that B1 has. As a general rule, excess of B vitamins are not considered toxic, although more recently people are starting to realize that it's really not a good idea to take too much of these, and that some of them are worse to overeat than others. And again, a deficiency in a single B vitamin is rare. Usually, if a person has a deficiency in one, they have a deficiency in others as well. And as you might imagine, the greater the caloric intake, the larger requirement for B vitamins. And if you're breaking down a lot more food, then you need these B vitamins to facilitate that. So this is a list of the B vitamins, and we'll go through them briefly, one at a time, but this will just give you a comprehensive list here. For some reason doesn't have the structure of B12. It is complex, but it's again, it's like a porphyrin ring. And again, these deficiencies in these vitamins cause the diseases listed here. And then you can also see that certain foods or food groups tend to have large amounts of certain vitamins, and those are also shown. And you certainly see some redundancy there, particularly like yeast. Yeast extracts are a very good source of B vitamins. So this is the structure of B1 or thiamine, and you're going to notice a lot of these vitamins have what looks like similar to a nucleotide base, in this case a pyrimidine ring. And this enzyme is, this vitamin is derived from a substitute of pyrimidine and a thiazole, and they're just coupled together through a single carbon or a methylene bridge. The active form is the triphosphate form, and just like we were talking about last time with some drugs that are administered without in a form that needs to be modified before it's active, so are the B vitamins. So again, if you have phosphates on the thymine, it's not going to go across the cell membrane. So it needs to travel across the cell membrane and then be phosphorylated. So B1 acts as a coenzyme in a number of carboxylation reactions, and as well as some transferases. And again, the early symptoms are loss of appetite, constipation, and nausea. Again, you're going to find some redundancy there. Now, thiamine, of course, is required for all living organisms, and it's synthesized by bacteria, fungi, and plants, but animals, including us, must obtain it from the diet. And again, the yeast or yeast extract is a good source, as well as pork. But a lot of cereal grains in this country are supplemented with B vitamins. The deficiency causes severe deficiency causes beriberi. Can be associated with alcoholism, possibly because alcoholics get most of their calories from alcohol and so don't eat a very good diet. Also in poorer regions of the world where they subsist basically on a diet of white rice, can cause beriberi as well as other vitamin deficiencies. And the major symptom here is this neuromuscular issues. Now, kind of group B2 riboflavin and B3 niacin together because they carry out the same type of reactions. And in fact, some enzymes can use either, but most enzymes use one or the other. And these, of course, are oxidoreduction reactions. We've talked about NAD quite extensively in its role in lactate, or the role of lactate synthesis in the production of NAD, so that you can keep running sugar through glycolysis. And so NADP, the phosphorylated form, does the same thing, as well as FAD or B2. And so just as an example, once again, hope you're all familiar with this reaction by now, the conversion of pyruvate to lactate to also convert NADH back into NAD, which is needed for glycolysis. So, and of course, these cofactors or enzymes are required in a number of different reactions that require transfer of electrons. And of course, the NADH is the high energy compound that really where we get most of our energy from. Okay, a lack of riboflavin causes this deficiency syndrome of inflammation in the corners of the mouth, the tongue, and the dermatitis as well. Severe deficiency causes much more serious dermatitis, almost like a sunburned skin, and diarrhea and dementia. So, we keep basically seeing the same kinds of things. And as you might imagine, those tissues that are fairly active and particularly dividing, like the skin or the intestinal tract, are going to be affected by a deficiency in these cofactors or B enzymes. Niacin is synthesized from tryptophan by humans, but very inefficiently, so it's not enough to supply us with what we need. Okay, this is the structure of B6 or pyridoxine. This is the active form again. It's the phosphorylated form, but if you were to take a vitamin supplement, you would take it without the phosphate, and then it would be phosphorylated or kinase once it got into the cell. So this is a cofactor that's needed in transaminase reactions, and we talked about transaminases extensively when we talked about amino acid metabolism. And so this is a cofactor that's needed for those reactions. And as you might imagine, the more protein you ingest, the more B6 you might need to break down those amino acids. Oral contraceptives can precipitate a deficiency. It's not clear why, to me anyway, why that happens, but I guess people on oral contraceptives should be aware that you might need a little extra B6. Mild deficiency can cause irritability, nervousness, and depression. So those of you whose friends get that way during exam time, it may be due to their diet, not the stress of exam week, or maybe both contributing. Severe deficiency causes much more severe symptoms, particularly neuro symptoms, and then a form of anemia that involves lysing of the cells. And we're going to see that again, that if cells can't divide, they tend to keep growing until they get so big that they just basically fall apart. So just to give an example, and this is one you've seen before, the conversion of alanine amino acid into pyruvate, and alpha-ketoglutarate, which here is called oxoglutarate, into glutamate. And that's the standard, as you recall, the standard transferase reaction, because glutamate then can transfer the amino group, or can convert the amino group directly into ammonia for excretion. Okay, the next enzyme, biotin, or calling them enzyme, the next vitamin, biotin, is a cofactor in carboxylases. We can get most of our biotin from intestinal bacteria, and this is, again, the vitamin that binds to a protein in egg whites, and so People that eat a lot of raw egg whites can oftentimes develop a deficiency of biotin because it forms a very tight binding and will then pass through the intestinal tract. This has been exploited in molecular biology labs by attaching the biotin to a nucleic acid probe and then hybridizing that to your sample, and then you can detect that with a fluorescent labeled avidin molecule. And I'll show you a quick example of a carboxylase that requires biotin. And this is the conversion of acetyl-CoA to malonyl-CoA, as you recall, the first step in fatty acid synthesis. We also, another example is in the conversion of pyruvate into oxaloacetate. So remember, pyruvate being a 3-carbon compound and oxaloacetate a 4-carbon compound. So if we have a lot of pyruvate and not enough intermediates in the TCA cycle, we can make some more oxaloacetate using the enzyme pyruvate carboxylase, which is really a 2-step process. Not really shown like that here, but to generate more intermediates instead of sending pyruvate directly into the TCA cycle through acetyl-CoA. Okay, folic acid is another vitamin, B vitamin. This is the one that's real yellow. This is its structure here, made up, there's really 3 parts to it. This double ring system on the left, para-aminobenzoic acid, or PABA, in the middle, and then glutamic acid. And folic acid, let's go to the next, is important in single carbon transfer reactions. Again, it's usually ingested as folic acid, but its active form is the reduced form to tetrahydrofolate. And we've talked about this a little bit. The enzyme that converts folic acid or dihydrofolate to tetrahydrofolate is dihydrofolate reductase, which is essential for DNA synthesis, and so has been a target for both cancer therapy and antibiotic treatment. And this, I think we've seen something similar to this before, but this is the reaction that converts DUMP into TMP by adding the methyl group underlined in red over here on the right. And the enzyme that carries out that reaction, thymidylate synthase, uses the methylene form of tetrahydrofolate. So it's called charged with a methyl group to add that to the DUMP. The unique thing about thymidylate synthase is that it also oxidizes the tetrahydrofolate. Most of the enzymes that use tetrahydrofolate or methylated tetrahydrofolate don't oxidize it, and so it's ready to go again, just has to be remethylated. But this enzyme oxidizes it, so it has to be re-reduced by dihydrofolate reductase, and that's why it's a good target for cancer, or I guess for antibiotics as well, because you can't synthesize thymidine without DHFR, and if you can't do that, then you can't make DNA. So it's a good inhibitor of DNA synthesis, even though it's an indirect inhibitor. We're going to come back to this in a minute because we're going to talk about B12 next, and it's very closely associated with folic acid. So again, cells cannot grow without tetrahydrofolate, and there are drugs that target the enzyme that reduces folic acid to tetrahydrofolate. Trimethoprim, which is an antibiotic that inhibits the bacterial DHFR but not the human enzyme. And then methotrexate, which inhibits the human enzyme, has been used extensively to treat cancer. Both of these are folic acid antagonists, or they're structural analogs of folic acid. So they bind and actually bind more tightly to dihydrofolate reductase than its normal substrate. So again, deficiencies cause an anemia. That's one of the commonest vitamin deficiencies. Again, it's very difficult to distinguish it from B12 deficiency because their actions are kind of intertwined, as we'll see in a minute. And it's increased demand during pregnancy or lactation, and as you might imagine, for if you have fast-growing cells, you need more folic acid. I've treated fruit flies with methotrexate, fetamethotrexate, and one of the results was that it looks like somebody just took a bite out of their wings. And so this is tissue that's growing very rapidly at a certain time in development, and without enough DHFR, because it's inhibited by the methotrexate, the wings can't fully develop. It's the same thing in humans. If you inhibit DHFR with methotrexate, you're going to stop the fast-growing cells, and that's, of course, the strategy behind treating cancer with the drug, and that's that the idea is that the cancer cells are growing much faster than any other cells, and so need much more of it. And so even though it does affect the normal cells, it affects the cancer cells to a greater extent. So there certainly are side effects involved, though. Okay, let's move on to B12. And this is the structure. It's a porphyrin ring, but in this case, there's a cobalt at the center, unlike iron in the center for hemoglobin or other molecules, other porphyrin rings that use other minerals. So again, the function of B12 and folic acid are interrelated, and they're both involved in methylation reactions. And then, of course, deficiencies in either one of these can produce similar symptoms. Now, I leave this last point in here. This is something that came out of the textbook, but I don't think that this is the case. I think there are a number of other enzymatic reactions that involve B12 in addition to its involvement in interacting with folic acid. But let's look at this next picture, and this may look a little complicated, but basically here we're looking at just a similar pathway that we looked at a minute ago with folic acid, and that's the charging of folic acid to make methylene tetrahydrofolate, and then to use that to transfer the methyl to DUMP to make TMP. Okay, and this shows that you need B12 over here, the blue lines at the bottom left, to put that methyl group on the folic acid. Okay, so both of these vitamins are involved here in the synthesis of TMP and therefore DNA. B12 to add the methyl group to the folic acid, and then folic acid transfers that methyl group to DUMP to make TMP. Okay, so this is B12 is the only known function of cobalt in the body. Again, this is synthesized solely in bacteria, but it can be concentrated in the liver of animals, so we can store some B12. It's can be a problem with people on a vegan diet. It's difficult to get enough B12, but there's also an intrinsic factor that is involved in transferring the vitamin across the intestinal wall that can cause some serious problems if it's not functioning properly. Okay, I'm going to show this, and I'm sure this looks very complicated, but much of this, again, you've seen before. Up at the top, we're looking at thymidylate synthase. And I should point out that I tend to go back and forth, but you'll see this enzyme called thymidylate synthase sometimes, and thymidylate synthetase other times, but it's the same enzyme. And again, the 5,10-methylene tetrahydrofolate needed to donate that methyl group to make thymidylate, and oxidation of it to dihydrofolate, which then can be converted back into tetrahydrofolic, here shown as THF by DHFR, or dihydrofolate reductase. And you can see coming in also that the 10-formyl tetrahydrofolate is used to in purine synthesis. If you remember the pathway there, that folic acid does donate single carbons to the molecule. And the one thing I want to point out here is that's a different form. This is a 10, meaning it's attached to the number 10 atom on the folic acid, which is a nitrogen, formyl tetrahydrofolate. So different enzymes require different forms of the methylated folic acid. In this case, in purine synthesis, it uses the 10-formyl form for thymidylate synthase. It uses the 5,10-methylene form. Now, over on the right side, we see the conversion of S-adenosyl homocysteine to homocysteine. And this, again, is another methyl transferring reaction. So then the homocysteine has to be, again, recharged to methionine. And it uses this enzyme that requires B12. And then that methionine gets adenylated to SAM, or S-adenosylmethionine, which is used for modifying DNA. And so this is an important pathway for regulation of DNA. And so the reason I want to mention that is that certain people have a deficiency in the enzyme, and that's shown on this figure. And one thing this figure points out is the link between folic acid and B12. Okay, and so we have the methyl tetrahydrofolate, which is converted to tetrahydrofolate and gives that methyl group to homocysteine to make methionine. And that enzyme requires B12, but also it's inhibited by nitrous oxide. And so there are a number of people in this country, maybe 20% of the population has a polymorphism in this gene that lowers the level of activity of this enzyme and makes it very susceptible to problems when they are exposed to nitrous oxide. And so this is something you're going to run into if you ever use nitrous oxide in the dental practice, that there's a certain population, and it's a significant population, or part of the population, that is very susceptible to nitrous oxide. And I'm sure you're going to hear more about this in the next couple of years. And this is why, because it inhibits the production of methionine, which then can't be used in a number of reactions, including methylation of DNA. Okay, so just to recap the B vitamins, again, these are all cofactors in different enzymatic reactions. It's probably good to have a basic idea of what's going on, that B1 is involved in carboxylases, B2 and 3, riboflavin and niacin, and oxidoreductases. Pantothenic acid, well, we didn't really talk about that. That's CoA, which is involved in transfer of acetic acid. B6 is used for transaminases, biotin for carboxylases, and then the last two, folic acid and B12, are both involved in single carbon transfers or methylations, and their activity is very closely linked. I showed you an example that B12 is used to methylate folic acid for some reactions, and we get kind of the other thing happening as well. There's one other, what we consider, well, it's a water-soluble vitamin. That's vitamin C, and we don't call it a B vitamin because it's not a cofactor in an enzyme, but enzymatic reaction, but it's a water-soluble vitamin. This is the structure shown here. And the deficiency causes scurvy, and it basically causes a defect in collagen synthesis. And so you can imagine that if you aren't making collagen the way you should, you're going to start having a lot of issues, because that's what holds everything together. You're going to start first having these, let's call it subcutaneous hemorrhages, or so it'll show up as little red spots on the skin. So just subcutaneous bleeding, basically. Muscle weakness, it's going to start to affect the gums as well, which are held together with collagen. Also can affect osteoporosis, and as you might imagine, affect wound healing and anemia. So it has a number of symptoms. So milder forms, which are more common, can cause easy bruising. Again, these sort of pinpoint hemorrhages under the skin, and can also affect the immune system. So people can be more susceptible to infection. And this is the sort of the basis of providing megadoses of vitamin C to prevent the common cold, also for cancer prevention. And I don't think that that's really been proven to be real effective. Okay, so this is how vitamin C is made. And the enzyme is absent in man and higher primates. But it's present in a lot of other organisms. So we need to acquire vitamin C through our diet. And of course, citrus is a good source of vitamin C. Okay, we're going to move on to the fat-soluble vitamins now. Since we're running out of time here. And these are not coenzymes except for one, vitamin K, which is involved in blood clotting. And they're not as readily absorbed from the diet as water-soluble vitamins, but they can be stored in tissues. Now, vitamin A and D can be toxic in excess. We generally think E and K are not so toxic, but of course, too much of anything probably is not a good thing. Okay, this is the structure of vitamin A, and it's cleaved into two molecules, retinol and retinoic acid. And these are the active forms. So this vitamin A can be stored in the liver, and it's transferred in, as you might imagine, since they're not very water soluble, they need some kind of transfer protein to move them about in the bloodstream from one tissue to another. Retinoic acid is a signaling molecule that interacts with a number of transcription factors. We might talk about that in a little more detail when we talk about developmental biology. And it has an important role in growth and development, particularly the central nervous system, but other areas of development as well. Deficiency is presented as night blindness, and severe deficiency can lead to permanent blindness. We don't see a problem in this country too much unless a patient has a severe disease or problem with fat absorption. But it's almost impossible to develop toxicity by ingesting normal foods, although taking too much supplements can cause some toxicity, and that's associated with teratogenicity. And that means, if you're not familiar with that term, it means development of the wrong tissues in the wrong place, basically, and so it's very important to avoid an excess of vitamin A during pregnancy. Okay, there are many forms of vitamin D. This is one of them, we call it a vitamin, although it's its role is to regulate calcium and phosphorus homeostasis, and so it's more like a hormone than a vitamin. As you might imagine from the structure, it's derived from cholesterol. We can produce vitamin D through exposure to UV light, our skin to UV light. And so if you have spent enough time in the sun, you don't need to take in much vitamin D. So it's the only vitamin that is not usually required in the diet, although in the wintertime it's more important to have a dietary source. I've reviewed a number of grant applications that were looking at the effect of vitamin D on periodontal disease, or periodontal health maybe is a better way to put it. And most of them get rejected for one reason, because they don't take into account the seasonal distribution of vitamin D, and that the fact is that people get a lot more vitamin D in the summer than they do in the winter. So if you're sampling people in the summer, it's going to be a lot different than if you're looking at them in the winter. And so if you don't take that into account, that can really make it difficult to interpret the results of any study. So insufficient sunlight and increased metabolism of vitamin A due to low calcium intake or absorption may lead to a deficiency. And this, of course, causes rickets, which is a softening of the bones. If it's severe enough, bones can fracture under the weight of the person. But even a less severe deficiency can cause the bones to break easier than they would under normal conditions. And there's been a lot of suggestion that vitamin D deficiency may cause gingivitis and may contribute to periodontitis. I think we're still trying to figure that one out. But you, again, may hear more about that in the coming years. Enhanced calcium absorption and bone reabsorption can lead to basically excess of calcium deposition or kidney stones, which can be a very serious problem. Now this is a map, and I've seen several maps like this, and they draw these lines in different places, but basically what they're trying to show here is that if you're far enough south in the wintertime, in this case January, you can still get enough vitamin C from sunlight. But if we look here, that Columbus is just into the dark blue area, which makes it the least likely to be able to get any benefit from sunlight in terms of vitamin D. Whereas down in the southern part of the United States, I think we still can get some vitamin D from the sun. Okay, this is again a structure of vitamin D, and it's a mixture of several compounds. So, and they all look similar, but have slightly different structures. There was this idea that vitamin E is associated with fertility and sexual activity, and there's some evidence to suggest that that may have some effect in some animals, but clearly not the case in humans. So I wouldn't try supplementing with vitamin E to help you with either of those things. This is the most abundant natural antioxidant, and deficiency in premature infants causes anemia, thrombocytosis, edema, so problems with blood cells. Okay, vitamin K, again, there's going to be some variation here in the structure. And this is essential for blood coagulation. It's involved in the post-translational modification of blood clotting factors. Inhibitors of vitamin K action are used as antithrombotic drugs. And one example, warfarin, is also used as a rat poison, but it's still used today, to thin people's blood. A friend of mine just had a valve replacement a few months ago, and he's been on warfarin ever since, and will be on warfarin for the rest of his life, but not the levels that are used for rat poison. Basically, what the rat does is it can't clot blood, and so it bleeds out. I just want to mention that there are a number of trace metals that are essential for healthy metabolism, required as components of different enzymes. I'm not really going to talk about these today, except just want to mention one thing, and that's the trace metal selenium, because it's gotten a little attention lately, because it appears that the primary toxic effect of mercury is in the inhibition of selenium-containing enzymes, and this is just a diagram that depicts that. So selenium binds very tightly to mercury, and so pretty much inactivates any, mercury will inactivate any selenium-containing enzyme, and these are enzymes generally that are involved in detoxification or an immune system. So, and again, mercury can have a cumulative effect. So this is, we're learning more and more about this, and there were a number of theories as to why mercury was so toxic, and this appears to be the major cause, the major problem with mercury poisoning. Okay, so that's a quick run through of the vitamins. We'll move on. Again, Tuesday is the second exam. We'll have a discussion on Monday, so if you have any questions about any of the material, you can bring them there, or you can contact any one of us individually.